To be able to understand this video, you need to understand a concept called mastery. Now, there's this writer called Malcolm Gladwell, and he talks about this concept of mastery. You can do something so well many times without even thinking about it because you've spent 10,000 hours in that skill. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to tell you to study for 10,000 hours for the GMAT, and certainly you don't have to study for 10,000 hours for the GMAT. But to be able to perform something at a very high level without even thinking about it, you need to have practiced that skill for a very long amount of time, a lot longer than you expected. That is the concept of mastery. Do not forget it for the rest of the video. And remember, you're not going to have to study for 10,000 hours, but we are going to talk about the skills that you need for the GMAT that require mastery. Now, the second thing that you need to understand is what the GMAT actually is. What does it measure? It's not really about measuring your math skills. It's not really measuring about your English skills. It's not a math and English test. It's a reasoning test. And so what is reasoning? Reasoning is this exercise or this conversation that you have with yourself to understand a problem in order that you solve that problem. And so how do you do reasoning? For example, I present you with a problem. And in that problem, you need to make a series of inference points. 4 or 5 inference points usually on GMAT questions. An inference point means that you read a certain piece of information and then you make a certain conclusion. For example, if I tell you that 20% of a class consists of girls, you should automatically in your head say that therefore 80% are boys. So it's a reflex. And so what I just did is an inference point. And in any problem on the GMAT, you have to do these inference points consistently. And so any problem usually involves 4 or 5 inference points. And that is reasoning. You make these inference points because you understand what you're reading, you infer, and you make all these inference points. And then you connect these inference points together in a certain direction. And so reasoning involves making these inference points and having the vision and the direction to know towards what goal you're going. These are the things that are involved in reasoning. And so for you to be able to reason very well, you need to be strong enough in making those inference points. You need to be fast enough, efficient enough in making these inference points, and you need to have that vision. These are the 2 things that you need for reasoning. Now, to be able to make inference points, your foundations in math and in English have to be very, very strong. If I ask you, what is the square root of 144? And you don't know, this means that your foundations are not good enough. If I ask you to solve a linear equation and it takes you 3 minutes, you have a problem. If you read a sentence and you struggle to understand the meaning of that sentence, then your foundations in reading comprehension are not good enough. Because the point of the GMAT asking you a question about reading comprehension passage or a critical reasoning passage is not to see that you can understand that word, but it's to see what you can do with that understanding. And so if you're able to demonstrate that in the GMAT consistently, then you will do well on the GMAT. And that is why the GMAT is very hard. So if your foundations in math or in English are very, very poor, or they're not strong enough because you've only practiced algebra or arithmetic or reading comprehension for, let's say, 6,000 hours, 7,000 hours, 8,000 hours, 9,000 hours, you've not mastered arithmetic, algebra, and reading comprehension yet. And so that is a problem. That is why you're not fast enough in making these inference points. Not having a level of mastery in arithmetic and algebra means that a question will take you 2.5 minutes instead of 2 minutes, 3 minutes instead of 2 minutes. That's 30 seconds more, 1 minute more. That is a lot of time because there are 70 questions almost on the GMAT. And so if you're 30 seconds or a minute late on every single question, you're not going to be able to score very well. And so if your foundations in math, if your foundations in reading comprehension are poor or they're not very strong, you're not going to be able to create these inference points fast enough. Now, the second part of reasoning was the vision, the direction. Are you able to understand what the objective is? Are you able to move consistently towards an objective? That requires experience. that comes with solving a lot of problems. And so if your foundation of understanding and reasoning, and if you lack the experience, or your experience in reasoning is not strong enough, you're going to struggle. And usually what happens is you won't know what to do on a problem. And so you look at this piece of information, and because you're not able to, let's say, manage the doubt that comes with the understanding of the problem, you're not going to be able to make a map and ask yourself or tell yourself, that is the direction that I need to go through. And therefore, let's make some inference points towards that direction. And so this capacity to reason with direction requires experience. And so if you have not mastered reasoning, you're going to have a problem on the GMAT. And so that is exactly why you have not improved on the GMAT. That is exactly why you're struggling with the GMAT. Maybe you've done it multiple times, but every single time you repeated the GMAT, all you did was more of the same. And so if you just opened the official guide and you solve problems again, you didn't really profoundly change how you reason. You didn't profoundly change and improve your foundations in math and in reading comprehension. So you kept doing the same, more of the same, more of the same. And if you keep doing the same things, you cannot expect a different outcome. Now, to improve the foundations, I mean foundations in math, basic math, right? You don't have to do advanced calculus. I mean very basic math, very basic algebra, and your reading comprehension. How you solve linear equations, basic geometry, things that you learned when you were 14 or 15. That's it. Nothing advanced. But those concepts, you have to know very, very well. You have to have mastered them. Now, as far as the process of your reasoning, remember that reasoning involves making inference steps towards a certain direction. Clarity in the direction, clarity in your objectives. You know that you want to go there. So that process, that vision, that direction, the ability to see the big picture, that is the other part of reasoning. That is also hard to improve, and that requires practice, but it also requires the desire. And so the way you can begin to improve that is by approaching problems or changing your focus on problems. So if you find yourself asking, how do I solve this problem, instead of how do I understand this problem better, that is something you have to change. Because the distinction is very, very important. You need to be obsessed more about understanding problems than about solving problems. You have to focus more on understanding problems. And so if your focus is to understand problems, you have this objective. They ask you to find something, find X, or find the number of people, or find the probability. And so you know that that is your objective. And then they present you with a certain problem. Your goal should be, knowing that that is the objective, your goal should be to understand all the different elements of the problem through this sequence of guided inference steps. Once you do that, these inference steps with direction, with keeping the end in mind. Very often people, when they're solving, they forget what they're looking for. And so that is poor reasoning. That is a poor process. So you have to keep always the end in mind. And so knowing that, you're doing these inference points, you're trying to understand the problem by making these guided and directed inference points toward a certain direction. Your goal is to understand. When your goal is to understand a problem, when your obsession, when your priority is to understand the problem, the solution will present itself naturally towards the end. And so, foundations, math, basically arithmetic algebra, foundations for the verbal reading comprehension, and the actual process of reasoning, the quality of your reasoning. Your reasoning should always be with a clear objective. It should be directed. It should be guided. So you make these inference points, and you are able to make these inference points correctly and quickly because now your foundations are strong. And so you see, if your foundations are very weak, you struggle to say 100 minus 80. You struggle to do 100 or square root of 144. That inference step is going to be slow. And so you will not be able to make the second inference step, which is founded on the first inference step. That is the importance of foundations. And so if your foundations are weak, even though you may have the desire to reason better with a clear objective, you're not going to be able to because it's taking you a long time to make and stack these inference points to arrive at the final destination, let's say, at the clear and explicit understanding of the problem, briefly, which is what allows you to solve the problem. And so if your foundations are weak, you're not going to be able to reason faster. You're not going to be able to apply or to execute the process of clear and targeted and directed reasoning. The question is, how long will it take? Well, let's go back to this concept that I mentioned of mastery. And so you can, for practical purposes, assume that mastery on the GMAT is a score of, let's say, 700 or more. So if your score is 700 or more, it means that you have mastered foundations of basic math and English, reading comprehension, and you have mastered reasoning. You're good at reasoning. You reason clearly, you reason explicitly, and you do that, and this is very, very important, you do it consistently, not for 10 minutes or 30 minutes. You're able to do it for 4 hours because you need to execute for 4 hours on the test, not for 30 minutes. And so if your score is 700 or a score of 700, we can assume is mastery in reasoning. And that is what's reflected. Now, the slowest score on the GMAT, as you know, is 200, but nobody gets 200 unless they just don't submit any answer. But if we look at a range, a practical range for someone who knows how to do math, who reads, but if we talk about a range of scores from 400 to 700, and so if your score is less than 400, it means your English is extremely poor. It means your math is extremely poor and you have to do a lot of work. But for practical purposes, we're going to look at the range of 400 to 700. A score of 700 presents or means that you've achieved mastery in reasoning. A score of 400 means that you have a long way to go. So if you're very close to 700, it means you've already developed the tools well enough to achieve a 700, and you just need to work on a lot of focus. You need to be more consistent. You need to really reflect and think about the quality of your reasoning and the process of your reasoning. But if your score is 400, you have a very long way to go in foundations and a very long way to go in improving your reasoning process. And so if you're closer towards the 400, 500 range, and your goal is to reach the 700 range, you have at least 18 to 24 months of preparation ahead of you. And anybody who tells you otherwise is not being very genuine. So be very wary of anybody who promises 200 or 300 point increase in 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 2 months even. Because of what I explained, you need to achieve mastery in certain foundational skills, to achieve mastery in your reasoning process, to be able to get the 700 score. And there are people who have already mastered these skills. And so when you're doing the GMAT, you're competing against a global pool of very motivated, self-selecting candidates. They've done their foundations, they've done their reasoning for a long time, even before they know what the GMAT is. That is, by the way, it seems like they don't need to prepare because they've already done their preparation. And so if your score is 400 or 500, you need 18 to 24 months because you have to improve your foundations, and that takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of repetition to achieve mastery in anything. Maybe you've done 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 hours in your lifetime, but now you need to do a lot more to go towards that 700 score. And so that is why some people seem not to study for a lot, but then they get a 700 or more score. They do a course and they study for 2 weeks, or they don't even do a course. They just buy the official guide. They do a few problems. They take the test, 700 or more. It's because they've already arrived at the level of proficiency that is required for the GMAT. They've already mastered the foundations of basic math. They've already mastered reasoning even before they know what the GMAT is, even before they make the decision to make the GMAT. And very often, they don't even know it. Who are these people, for example? So if you have someone who's an engineer, someone who studied engineering, someone who studied law, someone who practiced engineering or practiced law, someone who's a scientist, mathematician, a consultant, or anybody whose job function or whose temperament was such that they enjoyed and they have, in fact, solved a lot of problems for a long time, they've already achieved mastery. because they've already practiced the tools and the skills necessary to perform at the level of mastery on the GMAT. And they've done it for years. So you can consider that in essence, they've been preparing for the GMAT for years. So there's no way for you to arrive at their level in 4 months or 3 months, because they've been doing it for years in different contexts. You have to understand that very well. So if you're a student, let's contrast these two examples, right? These two extremes on the GMAT. Someone who's achieved mastery, someone who did not achieve mastery. If you talking about foundations, right? If you were a diligent student in high school, you did your homework, you did your algebra, you did your arithmetic, and you've been a consistently diligent student for a long time, you've already achieved mastery. If you were not a diligent student in high school, guess what? It's payback time. Now you're going to have to do it. And so the reason there are people who don't study for a lot, or it seems like they don't study a lot for the GMAT, and they do very well, it's because they've already worked on their foundations for a long time. They've already reasoned for a long time, and they've already studied, between quotes, for the GMAT in different contexts, doing the things that the GMAT rewards for a very long time before they even knew what the GMAT was, namely foundations in math, reading comprehension, and reasoning. Reasoning through their education, or reasoning through their job function, or reasoning just because of their temperament. They've been doing it for a very long time. They've already achieved the mastery. You're not going to catch up in 2 or 3 months. You have to do the work. Long story short, if your score now is around the 400, 500 mark, you need 18 to 24 months, mainly of achieving this mastery in basic maths and in reading comprehension. If you don't like to read, if I ask you what was the last book you read, you're like, I don't like to read, then means you need to work on your reading comprehension mastery. And that is exactly why you have failed to improve on the GMAT multiple times. And usually what happens is that once you get the low score that is very disappointing, usually what people do is, following a certain state of depression, they find another course and they do it again. And then it fails. Another, again, fail. And there, again, as I said before, they're doing more of the same. But now you cannot do more of the same. Now you have to work on your foundations, and you have to work on your reasoning, and you have to do it for a lot longer than you expect.